the next thing that we want to talk about is just to kind of give everyone a bit of an overview of what the standard PE protocol looks like. Okay, so the first thing that we can talk about is, what are the key components of PE? Okay. So really, when we think about this, we think about, kind of three main components. One component is psychoeducation, which includes our rationales for treatment and our rationales for in vivo and imaginal exposure. We really feel like it's important to share our rationale, why we're asking our clients to do the things we're asking them to do. Particularly because the things we're asking them to do, they think we're crazy for asking them to do. So these are all things they don't want to do, right? And so giving them a reason for it, the why, is important. Okay? If you ask me to do something that I'm like, I don't think I want to do that, you're much more likely to convince me if you tell me why. Okay, so the rationales are important. We also, as part of the psychoeducation component, are discussing common reactions to trauma with our clients to help them conceptualize and understand their symptoms. And, for many people, especially who are just realizing that it's PTSD that they've been contending with, this can be extremely helpful to really help put the pieces together. Another component of the psychoeducation is the breathing retraining, where we're asking people to practice a breathing technique, and we'll talk about what that is as part of their homework for us. So that's the psychoeducation piece. And then the other two pieces of PE have to do with exposure. So the first is the in vivo exposure, right? That's the real life, in life exposure, where we're asking people to gradually approach safe situations. Remember, safe is a key word there. We don't want the biting dog. Safe situations that the person is avoiding only because of their trauma-related fear. So they're avoiding them because of the experiences that they've had in their life, not because they are actually dangerous. Okay. Remember, some of these situations include things that are experienced now as, more dangerous, or that remind them of what happened. And then the final component is imaginal exposure, which is where we're asking clients to repeatedly recount their trauma memory, both in session and to listen to it at home for homework. And processing, which is what we do after we've done imaginal exposure, where we talk about what the client has learned while they were doing imaginal exposure, how their beliefs have changed as they were talking about it, or, since the last time that we discussed it. Remember, we said that, treatment can be, anywhere in a range from about 8 to 15 sessions. They're 90-minute sessions typically at this point. And, what that means is that, some people may finish pretty early with 8 sessions. Some people, 15 isn't a cutoff. It's just where we see, most people will be done by that time. But certainly we have seen some cases that will require a few more sessions. I've not really seen more than 22, something like that, 25 maybe sessions. For some really severe lifelong trauma kinds of situations. But for the most part, we see that people are finishing in those 8 to 15 sessions. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about each of the sessions and what's included in them. Now, this is going to be just a very brief Reader's Digest version. We're actually going to go into each of these components and talk about them specifically as we go through the next 4 days together. But this is just to give you kind of the overview of what each session looks like in the structure. So session 1 is the overview of the treatment program. Talking about how we're focusing in the treatment on PTSD symptoms. We're delivering the overall rationale for treatment, and we're talking about what the treatment procedures, the in vivo and the imaginal exposure, are. We then move into what we call the standardized trauma interview. That's in the appendix of your therapist guide, and is really a way for us to establish or confirm the index trauma and identify beginning and end points of where the trauma starts and ends. At the end of session 1, we introduce that breathing retraining technique. We practice it with them in the session, kind of talk them through it. And then we assign homework for them to practice that breathing a couple times a day, 10 minutes each time, to read the chapter for session 1 in the patient workbook, and to listen to the audio recording of their session once during the week. Now, session 2 is a very busy session. There's a lot going on in session 2. Sometimes people new to PE will break it up into 2 sessions. The VA does this regularly. They'll do a session 2A and a 2B. In session 2, first thing we do in all the rest of the sessions is review their homework. Okay. We'll talk about common reactions to trauma with them, again, helping them put the pieces of the puzzle together. We'll show and talk about the Dateline video, which I'm going to show to you guys after we're done talking about all of the sessions. And then if we're splitting it up, that's usually where 2A ends, right there. And then 2B would begin with talking about the rationale for in vivo exposure. We will introduce subjective units of distress and get anchor points for the SUDS scale. And then we'll construct the in vivo hierarchy with the client and set up their first in vivo homework assignments with them of how they're going to do this at home. And again, we end the session with assigning them homework. They're going to read the next chapter that corresponds to session 2. They're going to keep practicing the breathing retraining. They're going to add any ideas to the in vivo hierarchy that they might think of during the week. And they're going to start doing, we usually will assign 2 in vivo exposure practices or items for each week. We ask them to actually try and do them every day, but 2 different kinds of activities. And then again, to listen to the session 1 time during the week. So doing it in 1 session. Yeah. And the reason for that is I think that the in vivo exposure is the more potent, element of PE rather than, spending an hour on common reactions, let's say. I mean, common reactions are important, but I think that the in vivo exposure is going to have long-lasting effect throughout the treatment and beyond. And so I don't like to keep the active part, what I feel like is the active part of the treatment away from them for another week. And that's my reasoning behind it. However, having said that, there are times where I do choose, purposely to break it up. If I have someone who's like especially squirrely about the treatment, right? Our relationship maybe isn't 100%, they're not totally convinced. Then I might do a session 2A where I'm talking about the common reactions and kind of building the relationship. And so I'll do that, clearly with clinical reason behind it. Sometimes I see that people will break it up just because a particular client is chatty. And I don't think that's a great reason to do it. But certainly, as I said, they do it as a rule in the VA, it's set up where it's session 2A and 2B, and they do well, it's not going to ruin anything, but I am a proponent of trying to get it all in 1 session for sure. Okay, so after session 2, we're sending them home. They practice their first in vivo assignments, right? So this homework review is particularly important to talk about what they learned and how it went and, all of that good stuff. But we also have imaginal exposure coming up in this session. And so we don't want to spend too much time on the homework review. We can talk about more of that stuff at the end. We want to get into the imaginal exposure. So we're going to deliver the rationale for the imaginal exposure in this session. We're going to do imaginal exposure with them for, 40 or 45 minutes. We're going to spend 15 or 20 minutes afterwards processing the exposure. And then for homework, we're asking them to read the chapter that goes with chapter 3 to keep practicing that breathing retraining. This time when they're listening, they're going to listen to just the imaginal exposure. We're going to ask them to listen to just the imaginal exposure every day and to the full entire session just once. And we're going to assign new in vivos or reassign the ones that they haven't, fully gotten enough of in the last week. So we may end up with 2 new ones, 1 new one, and 1 old one. It can kind of go lots of different ways there. Okay, so that's session 3. Now, the good news is that after this, the structure of the sessions are pretty much the same, where we're reviewing their homework when they first come in, we're doing imaginal exposure with them, processing the exposure, and then, kind of talking about setting up the in vivo exposures and assigning homework. Okay. What that means is that it becomes, a little bit more routine. The client gets, kind of used to this is sort of the structure and the cadence of how therapy goes. And it starts to, just become a little bit easier for you because you don't have to prepare to give rationales and, all of that good stuff. Now, as we're moving, past these first couple of sessions of imaginal exposure, we're then starting to think about hotspots. So again, the structure here is the same, but we're looking at having the person focus on and pick out the most distressing pieces of the memory that we're working on to work on for the imaginal exposure. So they're just going to choose a section of the memory to work on in imaginal exposure. But as you can see, the structure is still the same: homework, imaginal exposure, processing, and then, kind of setting up homework for the next session. Okay. And then we're going to be working on those hotspots for the duration of treatment until we are ready for the final session. And in the final session, after we review homework, we're going to ask the client to do their imaginal exposure in this session on the entire trauma memory. So remember, we've just been doing kind of a piece or maybe 2 pieces or 3 pieces that we've been working on in hotspots. Now we're going to put that all back together. Going to do some processing. Processing's focus is a little bit different here, more about like kind of then and now, what we learned through treatment. We're going to ask them to re-rate their in vivo hierarchy to look at the differences from when we first created it to now here at the end of treatment. And we're going to have a discussion about, sort of what they learned, what was useful for them, how they can apply the skills that they've learned going forward in the future. So kind of trying to, help with generalization of the skills that they've learned. And then their homework is to keep applying all of these things that they've learned going forward. And remember, it doesn't have to be session 10. We've labeled it that way just for ease of, labeling. But it could be session 8 is the final session. It could be session 16, right? But we just call it session 10 for labeling purposes.